I'm going to go ahead and kick off with a bit of an icebreaker while everybody's getting organised and settled in. We have a couple of ways for you to let us know who you are and what interested you about joining for today. So in the chat, you're more than welcome. Please go ahead and drop a number 1, 2, or 3, depending on how well you know creatine, why you've joined today, if you work in the industry. Could be a combination. I can see Eric just put a combination of 2 and 3. That's fantastic. Amazing. Number 1. Everybody's welcome. So I hope today will be valuable, regardless of how much you already know about creatine. If you're a newbie or if you've been in the industry for 30 plus years, we've organized sessions that are going to be insightful for everyone. Fantastic. All right. Really great. So I think we are just about ready to get started for today. All right. Our speakers are all here. I can see you, and many people have joined. Fantastic. All right. So, hello, everybody, and welcome. Very exciting to see you all here with us today. Our very first Get Creatined live event. I'm genuinely glad that you're all here. And my name is Rachel Jennings. If you don't know who I am the co-founder and chief brand officer at Jenerise, and I'll be your host today. Everything is about creatine. That's the sole focus of this webinar. And it's a supplement that, in the way that we understand it today, has been around for more than 3 decades. But 2025 has definitely shaped up to be a turning point for creatine. It's probably part of the reason why you're here. It's gone mainstream. It's been in major publications this summer. And we've watched brands and suppliers, schools, sports organizations, practitioners, parents, and really big companies all ask the same questions. What's real? What's next? And what do people actually need to understand right now to support the next generation of creatine consumers and products? And today is all about giving you grounded, science-led clarity, and we can't wait to get started. So thank you for spending some time with us today. I have my wonderful co-host, Dave Slagle, as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Slagle. You may know me from such foundational wellness companies as Max Muscle Sports Nutrition, Robinson Pharma, Designer Protein, BioSchwartz, Radical Science, and my latest venture, the revolutionary Expo Fit Challenge, where networking meets next level fitness. But today, I'm really excited to be co-hosting this webinar focusing on creatine supplementation. Our expert panel is going to provide accurate and in-depth insights into creatine's historical evolution, the most cutting-edge applications, and predictions for the future. So I'm ready for an educational, exciting session. Thanks, Rachel.
Fantastic. Dave, I'm honored to be hosting alongside you. It's been so much fun prepping and getting organized for today. The agenda is up on the screen, so you can familiarize yourself. We're going to start with Steve Jennings, followed by Dan Richardson, and then a science finale for everybody with Felipe Ribeiro. A couple of housekeeping things before we jump in for today. The session will include 5-minute breaks in between the 3 speakers, just for us to reset. At that time, you'll see a QR code on your screen so that you can easily go and check out all of the speakers' Instagram profiles and find more resources and content there as well. You can drop questions in the chat at any time. Dave and I will be manning the chat for the duration of the session. However, all questions will be answered at the end. So we'll be selecting top questions, and then Steve, Dan, and Philippe will take turns at giving you some answers to what you want to know more about at the end of today's webinar. And finally, to remain objective, we've not accepted any sponsored content or any payment for today's session. All of the speakers are speaking independently, and we really hope to bring as much value to you as possible. So Without further ado, I am very excited to begin in a way that only feels right, which is with the person who laid a big part of the foundation for the creatine movement. You can follow him on Instagram if you're not part of the CreatinED community yet, head over there. I'm talking about my dad, Steve Jennings. He was the first person to bring creatine monohydrate, as we know it today in supplementation form, to the market in 1992. He's worked across every corner of the nutrition industry since then, but also took a pretty substantial break from the creatine space. He's experienced the breakthroughs, the misconceptions, the science, and he's got a pretty good idea of where this wave is going next. Today, he'll be sharing his presentation, which is called Creatine Then versus Now versus Next. And this is going to give us a really interesting perspective. So it's over to Steve, and I hope you guys enjoy this great presentation. And I'm just going to give Steve a quick little prompt to switch the tab that you're sharing on screen share so that people just see one slide at a time instead of this dashboard interface, which is great for you to use. And then we'll be all set. Amazing.
Okay, everybody, I'm here, I'm Steve, and I'm about to share with you what is actually quite a remarkable story about the entire evolution journey of creatine, and it goes back almost 200 years. Just to set some context, if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going, and I think this is really important in terms of understanding the evolution of creatine from its discovery right through to where we are today and where creatine potentially could go. There are so many clues in this almost historical story, and I hope that by hearing it and kind of interpreting it in your own ways, you'll maybe have a new way of even thinking about what's possible with creatine and where could creatine go based on where it came from. So this is a pretty standard, simple slide. What is creatine? For anybody that doesn't know, and I'm not assuming that everybody does, so we don't assume anything in life. It's a naturally occurring compound produced in the human body by the kidneys, liver, and pancreas. It's produced through enzyme-driven reactions involving amino acids and stored primarily in the muscles, which accounts for about 95% of that storage, and the brain 5%. And it's stored as phosphocreatine, which is utilizable energy when it goes through the ATP-ADP Krebs cycle. So it plays a pivotal role in energy metabolism and contributes to a broad range of physiological functions. And it's found in the diet in foods like red meat, and fish. However, dietary intake alone isn't sufficient to fully saturate the muscles and brain creatine stores. And this is going to become very important when I speak about people that are on predominantly plant-based diets and vegans. So the discovery of creatine goes back to 1832, which is a long time ago. And a French scientist called Michel-Eugène Chevreul, he isolated creatine from beef tissue, and he named the molecule from the Greek word kreas, which means meat. It's incredible to think that it was even possible to do something like this. If you try and imagine what the lab environment was that they were working in, what tools they had to work with, they had no internet, they had no way of sharing knowledge, of co-creating really with anybody. This was the mind of a genius, of which there were many back in the day. It was truly the mind of a genius who, on a hunch, followed that hunch, and it led to what we now know today as creatine monohydrate. It's actually quite remarkable. The story goes to the next level, actually, when a gentleman called Justus von Liebig, who was a German scientist, started building really on Chevreul's 1932 discovery. And in 1847, he confirmed and chemically identified creatine. So in quite a short space of time, there were two quite significant breakthroughs. But Chevreul took it to the next level. He realized and he recognized, and part of this was through a serendipitous moment with an acquaintance whose daughter was very sick. He'd been kind of using a meat extract himself, and it seemed to make him feel better. And he gave this to this young woman, and she recovered very, very quickly. And you'd think, well, that's just some kind of a story, but it wasn't. What he realized is that he was on the edge of being able to extract meat from, he was able to create an extraction, a meat extraction that contained very, very high levels of creatine monohydrate or of creatine. And with that knowledge and know-how, he launched the world's first creatine supplement. It was in the form of a paste that was a condiment that people used to add to their soups and, to soups and to dinner and things like that. And this product really took off. It exploded, actually. They built a huge manufacturing facility in Uruguay. They developed a group of technological innovations around meat processing. They developed innovations around entrepreneurial fundraising, organizational innovations, vertical integration, you name it, they did it. They even developed a little blue signature that became the trust mark. And this product exploded globally. They were selling huge amounts of this meat concentrate all over the world. And it eventually led in 1910 to the meat paste or the meat extract pivoting into what maybe we saw when we were growing up with in the kitchen at home, the OXO cube. And it was the same company that eventually developed the OXO cube. And that became, quite a big staple in the kitchen. It didn't contain as much creatine, but it was a very, very convenient way of having a meat extract that you could very easily and conveniently add to soups and puddings. It was given to soldiers during World War I. It was in their kit bags so that they could have a warming drink. It became a very versatile product. And the similarities are actually quite uncanny when you compare where creatine has been for a long time with what we're now seeing, which is the pivot into very convenient products aimed at a much wider consumer group. And I'll get much deeper into that in a few minutes. So from 1911 to 1991, there wasn't the kind of breakthroughs that I've just spoken about and just mentioned. There was a lot of deep work. These were curious and scientists with a lot of ingenuity doing deep work around creatine, around its impact on the muscle, its impact on muscle strength, but they were using quite rudimentary tools. But they were also starting to see that it had other applications, but a lot of the tools that they required to go much deeper didn't exist. The key breakthrough during this time was an entirely new kind of muscle biopsy. And it was that muscle biopsy in the late 80s and early 90s that led to what was arguably the single biggest creatine breakthrough. And that was with this research paper that was written by Dr. Roger Harris, Professor Eric Hultman, and Professor Karin Zonderland, who did most of their research at the Karolinska Institute up in Sweden, very close to it was in Stockholm. And this seminal paper, the breakthrough paper, it demonstrated actually categorically that giving an athlete or a person creatine around about 5 grams per day would lead to a 1 to 3% performance improvement in explosive sprint and power sports. And at this moment in time in 92, I was the founder of a sport nutrition brand out of the UK. And I received a telephone call on the 3rd of March from Roger Harris. And he got our contact details because we were already providing product and know-how to the British Olympic team, preparing for the Barcelona Games in 92. And there was no internet, so I didn't really know who Roger was. I knew who Eric Holtman was because he'd done some carbohydrate research, but when Roger called me, I didn't know who he was. And he asked to meet with me 5 days later on the 8th of March. And I went to that meeting, not really knowing what to expect. And the meeting took place in the north of England. It was at a country hotel, and it was a life-changing moment, I think, for the three of us that were in the room, including Eric. They handed me a 1 kilo bag of creatine monohydrate, the kilo, and they gave me a printed version of the yet-to-be-published research paper. And armed with that, they gave me a challenge. Can you get this product into the hands of some of the athletes who will be competing in Barcelona? If you do, there's a real probability that they'll win gold medals. And they literally gave me that challenge. And that is how my journey with creatine began. 47 days later, 7 days later, we had this. I was very lucky to live very close to a small pharmaceutical company. And the very first product, the very first modern day creatine product that was ever developed was an effervescing tablet. You dropped it in water, it dissolved, and you drank it. And that lucky break with the pharmaceutical company gave us everything we needed to be able to go with the paperwork to the British Olympic Association, the Sports Council. With the support of Eric and Roger, we were able to convince them and give them the confidence to allow the Olympic athletes to start to work with creatine. It was confirmed that it wasn't anabolic. They wouldn't be compromising any doping tests. It was found in food. And it literally began as simple as that. The effort that went into getting us to this place and bringing us all the way to the games in Barcelona, it was 7 days a week, not really sleeping. It was just focused on what the mission was all about. But what was happening in Barcelona is that a huge story was brewing that we didn't know about. And we received a telephone call on the 26th, 27th of July from an investigative journalist. He'd got wind that the athletes from the British team had something, and he gave us a choice. I'm either going to break this as a doping story, or I need to know what's really going on. So Roger, Eric did all the real heavy lifting, gave him everything he needed for the story. We had the documentation from the British Olympic Association and the Sports Council, and he wrote a story which changed the face of modern day supplementation. From this moment on, we won gold medals, a total of 5, but these were the 2 big athletes that got all the publicity, Linford Christie and the amazing Sally Gunnell. The story went full viral, pre-internet, pre-social media, pre-influencers. For Roger and myself, it was like hanging onto the wing of a jet for about 2 years. It was non-stop. It was amazing. It led to moments that I could have never imagined a matter of months earlier. In '93, we filed a very important creatine patent. And in that patent, we referenced mood disorders, dementia, chronic fatigue syndrome, anxiety disorders, brain-related disorders. And, you know, a lot of you may be asking yourselves, how did you know about this? And we're only just now starting to realize the huge implications of bringing creatine into that world alone. It's a long story, but there's a massive story behind what happened from this patent being filed to now. The other huge breakthrough, and it's really important that Anthony and Ed are part of this story, was in the USA. Anthony Almada, a very, very, very smart biochemist, and his businessman partner, Ed Bird, they obviously read about the creatine in the media, and they also started to, they founded EAS, they were looking for a direction, and they had a vision for commercializing creatine in the USA that took creatine to a completely different level. They had a connection with a man called Bill Phillips. He had a huge muscle media empire and a magazine called Muscle Media 2000. And that magazine took creatine into the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the USA. By the time of the Olympic Games in '96 in Atlanta, around about 80% of all athletes competing across all sports were on some kind of a creatine regime. So in 4 years, it went from being non-existent to being a staple in hardcore sport, high performance sport, gyms, bodybuilding. In that space, it really established itself extremely quickly. Dave Slagle, who's one of the hosts of this webinar tonight or today, he was one of the very first people in the world to start taking it as what you would call a consumer. He began in April 1993, which was literally a few weeks after Anthony and Ed launched phosphagen in the American market. Creatine approvals were given during this period. USDA approved it in 2020. EFSA, the European Food Safety, gave approvals in 2011 and 2016. But it still looked like this. Even as recent as 2021, it was still powder and predominantly in this world of quite hardcore, but it was a big market. It was a growing market, but it was people that felt they needed to get muscle gain from it. They needed to get gains in being able to push harder, more reps, recover faster. The transition to the mainstream, people like our parents and our neighbors, hadn't happened as recently as 2021. And it's unbelievable to imagine now what has happened in the last 4 years. It's truly astonishing. So really, there's been a realization, and this is the now. So here we are. We have vast amounts of substantiated science. Some of it is evidence that is proving that across a number of new benefits, new research, new benefits, there are applications for entirely new audiences. We start thinking about women's health. We start thinking about aging population, health span, longevity. We start thinking about brain health. We start realizing that the benefit for vegans alone can be transformative. And it's metabolic health, cognitive support, enhanced mitochondrial function, cellular energy, the possibilities in terms of GLP-1 and this new way of losing weight, which is going to have a huge impact on the mass population, and providing muscle support to help offset atrophy as people lose weight and lose muscle. These are huge new benefit opportunity areas. The next creatine consumers are really cross-generational. It's really looking at this through a start early lens. It's about ageless vitality. The older you get and as you age, your need for creatine improves significantly because your body's capability to produce creatine starts to diminish. So you need to be, supplementing your diet with creatine from either from food, which you don't get that much. Primarily, it's coming from powder and new delivery systems. This is really exciting. The new big growth driver of creatine are women. The women have really started to understand the implications for what it means to them. The women's health implications, and within women's health, what's possible is answering so many questions and needs that women have, from fertility to during pregnancy, to childbirth, to menopause, to bone health. It's a very, very long list. And even if this was the only breakthrough area, if this was the breakthrough area, it's transformational for human health. It's transformational for creatine. The power's really shifting, and what has happened is that influencers and some of the really huge big influencers that have got huge reach have started to talk about creatine, bring guests onto their shows that talk about creatine. You've got some of the top leading scientists now talking on social media about creatine. You've got other influencers that are talking about creatine. And what we've seen is a shift in where people are getting their knowledge about creatine from. This is very, very important. The popularity as a result of this has increased significantly. If you look at, we did a little, we just went into altmetric and just played around with the dashboard. And you see this quite flat curve until 2015, 2020, it starts to pick up. If we did this on a true year-by-year basis, the way that curve has gone from the beginning of 2014 to 2024 to almost the end of 25 is truly astonishing. It's close to vertical. The interest, the appetite for more knowledge about creatine, the search inquiries are just, it's absolutely staggering. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of % increase in just the population's interest in wanting to know about creatine. But it begs the question, how much of this is actually signal, but how much of it is noise? We've already had the first moment where the banana skin caused creatine to experience what is known as Gummygate. It led to a lot of negative press, a lot of controversy about gummies. What's in gummies? Is there anything in gummies? Are gummies the right thing to be taking? And at the end of the day, everything that creates a stronger product and better knowledge is good. And it's been quite interesting actually to see what has happened. Gummygate has pretty much had no negative impact on consumer confidence in gummies. We're still seeing gummies as the preferred, fastest growing dosage form for consumers. I haven't got the numbers from Spins for the end of 25, but at the end of 24, it was showing 360% year-on-year growth. There's no reason to think that that's slowing down anytime soon. And the Vitamin Shops 2025 trend report, which came out recently, is showing a 1,300% year-on-year for gummies search over 2024. So Gummygate hasn't had any real negative impact on gummies in the eyes of the consumer. What it has done, it's forced manufacturers and the companies that are developing the technology that makes creatine stable in a gummy up their game. They're having to go the extra mile and much more to reassure consumers. And it's also made it much easier to identify the bad actors that are selling snake oil. And there are many of them in the world of supplements. Taste and convenience is what is really bringing creatine now into this new world. We've got a better understanding as we approach the end of the year what creatine in ready to consume could conceivably look like. From energy bars to gummies to coffee in capsules, effervescing tablets, shots, creatine in little pots of pudding or yogurt, creatine in cereal, creatine in protein beverages, powder in stick packs, which are super on trend at the moment, creatine that you can chew, creatine in beverages, even though we're still in need of a truly liquid stable creatine technology. And in Brazil, we've even found a creatine gel. So there's lots of little companies that are trying to find out what's possible. What's the next thing that's going to follow gummies as the next big breakout? Nobody knows right now. It's just a matter of entrepreneurs trying new things, experimenting, using their ingenuity, and just seeing what the next one is that consumers or people that want to start taking creatine in new ways decide to go with. It's a very exciting time. We've got new growing claims coming out. We've got formats that are leading this growth. We've got research in performance on the decline, but research around health and clinical cognition and neurological issues and clinical applications growing massively. So we're seeing a wind of change now really driving creatine and almost pulling creatine into this new world, which is going to open up creatine to probably hundreds of millions of people that have yet to try it, but really need to be trying it and using it. Creatine powder still dominates. It's super versatile. You can add it to anything: soups, puddings, salad dressing, smoothies, you name it. You can add powder to pretty much anything. Coffee, tea. I even know people that add it to, you know, half a glass of beer, and they mix it in and they drink their beer with creatine in it. I know it sounds a little crazy, but people find what works for them, and that's their thing. And interestingly, when you think about innovation, it's very easy to think you've got to push the innovation envelope out. You've got to go far out into areas that are, you know, totally brand new. And sometimes that's not the way to bring people along with you. And sometimes just a little small 20% innovation can be all it needs to transform a product or brand, the product or brand advantage that you're looking for. Most of those products that I've just shown you a couple of slides ago, they're very simple ideas. They're existing products that are infused with creatine and are great ways of testing out what works, what doesn't work, when you've got a finished product that you can actually get into the hands of people. So now we come to creatinification, and this is where things get really quite interesting, because it also is really looking at future facing, future casting. Where could this go? What is possible? I think this is really the defining decade. And by that, you know, are we in a hype cycle? Could this all fizzle out? I truly believe that this time it won't. I believe this with all my heart. We've truly crossed the threshold this time into creatine being cared for by scientists that are doing the great work. There are companies that are in this for the long play. I'm talking decades of long play. There are people building brands that are in it for the long play. When you work with people like that, you're playing by a different playbook. You're working to a different set of rules. And it's a great place to be if you're you're an innovator, you're a human biologist, you're a chemist, you're somebody that's interested in this area, because creatine is on a multi-decade journey as we start to realize truly what's possible. It's already moved beyond sport. We're now in kind of the place that I call active, and it's on this wonderful journey into the mainstream. So we call this the era of agelessness and fearlessness. And it's really the erosion of traditional life stages. It's reaching your 50s and 60s and 70s, having the heart that you had when you were younger, but also feeling that vitality that gives you that ability to still do things as you age that you love to do. You can still hike, you can still play tennis, you can do fun things with your grandkids. And I think people that, you know, grew up in the 60s and 70s, I'm one of them, we have a different perception of what aging means to us in 2025. It's very different to our parents and grandparents. We grew up with pop culture. We were there the day that Red Bull entered the market, which was nearly 40 years ago. We've lived through the world pre-internet. We've experienced the internet and the digital revolution unfolding. We don't want to get old. We are, but we want to remain young in our hearts and continue to contribute meaningfully to our communities, our families and society. It's an amazing place to be. And I can vouch for many people that are like me, we're in our 60s and 70s. It's an amazing place to be, with the science and the new research that's pointing us in all sorts of remarkable directions, not just with creatine. So it's about closing the health span gap for millions and millions of people. It's life-changing, it's human health changing. It's going to change the way that populations imagine what's possible, whether it's prevention, whether it's helping people get better after they start recovering, or they're recovering from an illness. We're truly crossing the chasm now. We're kind of in this 2025, 2028 space. The dates really for 2029 onwards could be compressed significantly. I'm just kind of imagining that it's probably going to take to 2029, but it may not. We're moving very, very fast at the moment, and that trajectory is only going to get faster. Creatine is still relatively small when you compare it to protein supplementation, which in 2024, protein supplementation, the market was $26.2 billion. Creatine globally in 2024 was only 1.1 billion, which is still quite big, but it's relatively small. We believe creatine is the next big thing to go on the journey that protein has been on now for a few years and is now fully on, which is the proteinification of everything. When you look at 2030, potentially 4.3 billion is what's being projected. That is only for powders and gummies. It does not include breakthroughs in liquid stable creatine. It does not include breakthroughs in new technologies. And there's no reason why we cannot start thinking like we do in technology. What are the 10x multipliers? How do we 10x the market? And it's not about 10xing it because there's money to be made, which is important for companies that are in this space. It's how do we reach more people? How can we truly take creatine from the 32 to 35 million people that are using it on a daily basis today to 320 million people? How do we get it to 1 billion people in the next decade? Because then we're having profound impacts on human health. It's the compression in terms of how we can do this is going to come from a combination of emotional intelligence, human imagination, and the realization that AI is going to be this incredible augmentation tool that enables us to turn the emotional intelligence and the human imagination that we have into vision that becomes reality much faster than we've ever seen it happen in the past. It's going to compress research at warp speed. We're going to get papers coming out much faster, clinical studies taking place much faster, human clinical trials taking place much faster. This is going to just speed up the possibilities with creatine. And you start to realize that 10x multipliers in this space can be very, very real. This is not me just pontificating and blue sky thinking. To do this, it's going to require a shift in mindset from some of the best people, best researchers, best Imagineers, best innovators in the world, from both within the food industry and from outside the food industry. And when we bring these people together, we make magic happen, and we only speed up the ambition that we have to bring creatine to more people. So what could this mean for creatine? So this is just one thesis. This is just one thing that it could mean. Does it mean that creatine could be part of our fortification future? Which is quite interesting to think about. If we think about fortification today, iron, folic acid, vitamin D, vitamin A, iodine. Why? They're deficiency driven. They're relatively cheap. They're ultra stable. They're easily mass distributed, and their impact is clinically undeniable. Creatine ticks all of those Y boxes. Fortification future, sarcopenia, falls and fractures, frailty, cognitive decline, post-hospitalization muscle wasting, metabolic inflexibility. Could creatine end up becoming commoditized? New delivery formats, bioavailability is going to rule for sure. Liquid finally becomes the norm. So we have forms of creatine that you can drink that are super convenient. Do we start thinking of creatine as critical infrastructure, not just an ingredient? And by infrastructure, it's looking at it through a full holistic 360 lens. all of the use cases, what is possible across the entire spectrum of aging and life. It's absolutely amazing that today across the globe, we're actually connected through the internet, and we can, make all of this happen so much faster. So creatinification is happening. Beverages will come on stream in the next 12 to 24 months. We're starting to see explorations into baked goods, confectionery. It's not inconceivable that we could have pasta, creatification of pasta, popcorn, ice cream, tea, instant coffee. I'm not here to play the role of the food police and start to talk about what is right for people to eat, what is ultra-processed food. My story isn't about that. My story is about how do we bring creatine to the mass population in forms that are super convenient and taste great. When we look at fortification, it actually starts to look crazy. Could we fortify rice? Could we fortify dairy? Could we fortify flour? Could we fortify salt? What if creatine was in water? You're starting to look at technologies that exist but have never been applied to solving this problem for creatine. When you think about it through the fortification lens, we could touch 2 billion people. 2 billion people globally. From where we are today, let's say best case scenario, 40 million people. We could touch 2 billion people with creatine and all the health benefits. Unbelievable. I want to be part of this so much. I'm throwing in a provocation. If you've never seen the monologue on the fall of the House of Usher, please watch it. It's quite important in the context of two kind of a fork in the road in terms of where creatine could go. I'm not here to say which is the right road, which is the wrong road. There's just the two roads that it could go down. It's probably going to go down both of them. Watch the fall of the House of Usher, Lemons. Just Google it, YouTube it, and watch it. It sounds totally crazy what the guy on the right's talking about, but it's not. I know of a number of groups that are imagining a future in longevity that looks like that model. Which playbook wins? I don't know. I don't think any of us do. But I will tell you which playbook I do want to win. But before I do that, for anybody that's watching this, that is working with creatine today, that is selling creatine, that is manufacturing creatine, all you have to do is focus on what matters. And you decide and determine what it is what matters to you. Nobody else. You determine what matters. Our mission at Jenerise is incredibly simple. We want to initially increase global creatine adoption tenfold. It's not Jenerise is going to do that. It's going to be in the ecosystem, working to be something that helps catalyze that transformation from where it is to where it can be within the next 5 years. It comes with huge challenges that go right back to the beginning of the supply chain. It is hugely complex, and it's a huge once-in-a-lifetime challenge that the team that we're assembling at Jenerise are stepping into. We are fully game on for this. The great Dr. Harris, who was the first mentor in my life, and he sadly passed away last November. I was on a car journey with him. I spent a lot of time with Roger in the first 18 months that we got to know each other. And I vividly remember being in the car. Roger was the most eloquently speaking person you could ever imagine. An amazing human, could speak about everything and anything. His interests were so broad and wide. I wish he'd have given a TED talk like Sir Ken Robinson. He would have given a Ken Robinson-like TED talk. I so wish that he'd have done that. He mentioned to me, and he said to me, and I remember him saying this, One day, Steve, everybody will take creatine. He knew what was possible in 1992. I have made a commitment to the creatine community, the scientists, the people named on this slide, that is what brought me back, and that is what Jenerise is here to do. Nothing else. One day, everyone will take creatine. Thank you so much for listening to me. I know I get very passionate. It's a great honor and it's a great privilege to be able to share this with you. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Steve, thank you so much for sharing your story with everyone here on the call today. And we're going to go ahead and take a 2-minute break. And while we are taking a break, there's a question up on the screen. And the question right now is, if you could change one thing about creatine products or the way that they're marketed today, what would that actually be? It's an open question for all attendees. Feel free to drop your answers in the chat. And you can also use the QR code in the meantime to go ahead and check out the Instagram profile for our next speaker, which is Dan Richardson. And I will see you in about 2 minutes. All right. Fantastic. If anybody else wants to share their answer to our question in the chat, feel free to go ahead. We've got a couple coming through. Eric just said to discuss the life story of creatine and how it's useful across all ages. Really, really great. Across the lifespan is absolutely such an appropriate way to talk about creatine following the recent science and research. Mustafa also said to maybe shift the focus from gimmicky, quote, exotic forms to education on proven efficacy and safety of creatine monohydrate. So question still stands. Feel free to drop your answers in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker for today, someone that I've had the pleasure of working with this summer as one of our leads on the creatine education program here at Jenerise. Our next speaker is somebody that I really admire. His ability to translate science into real-world nutrition is unmatched. And Dan Richardson is who I am talking about. He's a performance nutritionist working across elite sport in the UK. Dan works with some of the greatest teams in the United Kingdom, such as Leeds United Football Club, Leicester City cricket, also the British Cycling Association, and many, many more, not to mention more than 120 academies and schools across the UK where Dan specifically helps guide young athletes in their nutrition journeys and also helps foster their relationship with creatine. So today, Dan will be diving into how creatine fits into everyday nutrition. So this applies to all of us. We all eat food and all of us need creatine. So during this session, I will be responsible for managing Dan's slides. So I'm going to go ahead and get those set up, ready to share with you, and we'll be ready to roll. Dan, as soon as you see your slides, we'll be ready to go. Enjoy, everyone.
Excellent, Rachel. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing the slides appear. Thankfully, a last-minute technical difficulty with my laptop means that Rachel's kindly going to be clicking through my slides this evening. My first slide that will be up very shortly is an introduction slide, which I don't think I can top what Rachel said about myself. But I'm, like Steve, a bit of an ex-athlete myself. I was a professional or semi-professional rugby player for around 2 years, playing a lesser-known sport in the UK known as rugby league. I'm sure a lot of our international audience will be aware of rugby union, but the smaller, more, I suppose, northern version of the sport I played for about 2 years. And that led me to really kind of go down the path of sports nutrition and understanding sports nutrition, which has now led me to a decade in the industry as a sports nutritionist with professional athletes. And as Rachel said, working with the likes of Leeds United, Leicestershire County Cricket, Forest Netball, and of course some of the British organisations like British Cycling, British Rowing, etc. But today's talk, I'm really going to start to talk around, I suppose, what my passion is and where creatine fits into that, which is the everyday use of creatine, but also understanding it from a sports perspective. And the first place we've got to start on that journey really is sports energy balance, which on the next slide, as we move to it, I will ultimately start talking around that as well. Which for me, I think the big thing to understand here is when working with athletes or even individuals, we have to understand this kind of concept of sports nutrition. Now, I get asked a lot how to summarize sports nutrition in the space of an individual slide, and I'm going to try and do my best in this one slide here. But arguably, energy balance effectively is the be-all and end-all of sports nutrition. Energy in versus energy out. I'm sure we've all heard it before. It's been well publicized. But trying to break that down in a little bit more detail, I think, is really important. There's also another side to this called energy availability, which is often something we use with professional athletes to ensure that they have energy intake available for when expenditure becomes harder and food and restriction of food isn't as available. So on this slide here, you can see that we've got our energy intake over the left-hand side. That's all the food that we consume, your typical kind of foods, such as your macronutrients, your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins, your fruit and vegetables, your micronutrients, the little things that make the big difference when it comes to sports nutrition, and also that small sliver there that you'll all be happy to see of chocolate crisps, sweets and biscuits. Absolutely an essential to balanced eating and, of course, a healthy intake. And then over the other side of the screen, we'll go a bit more technical, and I've tried to, and I know the prompt from Rachel when setting this up was to stay away from the science as possible. So I'll break this down in lay terms for those that maybe haven't seen a total daily energy expenditure graph before. This is ultimately what the majority of an individual will burn across a day. And you can see the 95% scale along the side. I'll explain that very shortly. But we've got BMR, which is our basal metabolic rate. For those that maybe aren't too science adapted, think of this as the energy that we need to live. Now, that energy expenditure contributes to about 70% of our total daily energy expenditure. And that's our resting energy. Then we've got our non-resting energy, which are the three acronyms that you see above that. So you've got your NEAT, which isn't being neat and tidy, unfortunately. It's your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Basically, all movements that aren't related to exercise. Me talking right now, throwing my arms around because I like to gesticulate, is energy burn. If you laughed at that as a bit of a joke, that's energy burn. We might potentially be, kind of, I suppose, stood up while looking at this presentation. Energy burn. It's unplanned activity across the day that makes up around 15% of our total daily energy expenditure. Then we've got TEF, which I'm hoping all of us have done some of this today, which is eating food, digesting food, and metabolizing food. And that is the thermic effect of food. And that makes up around 10% for most individuals. And then finally, right at the top, and this is where I allude to this, with a lot of the athletes I work with. We've got EAT, which isn't eating because we've already covered that, but that's the opposite of NEAT. So that's exercise, activity, thermogenesis. This is the planned activity that we have within the day. And arguably, for most people taking part in sports recreationally and not at a complete high level where they may be doing multiple hours in the day, those that maybe are doing an hour in the evening and an hour in the morning, that would ultimately make up around 5% of our total daily energy expenditure. So before we move on from this slide, one of the big things I always talk about is ultimately how our energy intake is impacted by our energy expenditure. And 95% of the time, if our energy intake or energy expenditure, stays the same, our energy intake can remain the same as well. So moving on to the next part of my session and the next slide from there, ultimately, the big thing I always talk about when speaking with athletes around sports supplements, and Steve did a brilliant job of talking us through the journey, and he mentioned pyramids quite a lot during his talk and that kind of foundation. And I think nutrition and how that applies to everyday individuals and athletes forms a pyramid. Now this here, taken from, I believe, MyFitnessPal as an image, depicts really nicely the different tiers of sports supplementations or sports strategies that we may look to use. Now, all sports supplements, inclusive of creatine that we see at the top there in tier 5, are redundant unless we can complete tiers 1 to 4. So tier 1 is having high quality foods and ensuring that they're whole foods, supporting our overall health and baseline level of nutrition. We've then got our micronutrients, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the little things that make the big difference. So ultimately the vitamins and minerals that help our body to stay healthy, free from illness, and also reduce the risk factor to injury. And then, of course, we jump up to tier 3, which gets a little bit more technical, specifically for athletes, which is nutrient timing. So we're thinking around those different foods at different times in the day. So one of the things we might have heard of is phrases such as carbohydrate loading, or potentially phrases like nutrition periodization. That would fall into tier 3. And then eventually we move on to kind of the more technical areas, which is the sports fuels and the supplements, tier 4 and tier 5. Now in sports fuels, these might be things such as powderized carbohydrates or a sports-based carbohydrate drink, ultimately looking at the once removed from foods. And then finally, we have our supplement-based compounds, our creatines, our caffeines, our protein powders, all of the above, our vitamin and minerals that ultimately help us become and strive better and give us that extra 1%. Specifically, when we're talking about athletes, we've got to think about that continuum for them. A lot of athletes do this top down instead of bottom up. They start at tier 5 and then work their way down to tier 1, which is absolutely not the way I educate my athletes. We have to be doing the basics right. And this sits well with creatine as well. So through to the next slide, we'll see that ultimately when we're talking about creatine and how that fits within the sports supplement model is we have to rationalize the use. Now, Steve has done a brilliant job of explaining all of the many benefits of creatine and how that was founded even in 1992, and some of the patents that came out off the back of that ultimately rationalized the use of creatine without having to go through this. But I wanted to put this model in place so people can see how creatine really will take effect and still continue to be used in the sports world and everyday usage. So this is an adapted kind of, I suppose, chart, that the decision tree chart, however you want to see it, of utilizing any supplement. It's a decision matrix. But if we work through this matrix together, you'll see here that arguably we start with, does the nutrient, does the form of nutrient fall into one of these supplement categories? We can go through there. If it's a yes, we move on to the next, which creatine would likely do so. Now we'll see here that ultimately the point that we get to is that almost 0.4 on there, which is from Graham Closer, Professor Graham Closer's paper, which is there a reason you cannot use a whole food source to get the desired nutrient considered as the food first, but not food only guidance points? And if we look at the next slide, we'll see that it's very difficult actually with the numbers that are coming out around the usage of creatine to actually be able to do the typical serving of 3 to 5 grams or potentially higher, which I'll talk about a little later on in my talk. But actually, if we do stick to food first, yes, we can get foods that are high in creatine. A lot of our meats, milks, etc., will have and contain some high quality creatine within there. But ultimately, for us to get the desired effect that we see within laboratory-based researches and on the field research in the sports world, we're going to really struggle to do so through food. Now, I always say that if we're considering trying to get, you know, a decent amount of, I suppose, of creatine through foods, we'd almost want to be eating upwards of 2.5 to 3 kilograms of meat per day, which I'm sure for most of us, we won't be taking that away as nutritional guidance from today's session. So we have to start understanding this food first, but not food only approach when it comes to creatine, which leads me on to, I suppose, some of the parts around creatine that arguably are really important to understand in our everyday and sports use. Being clear on the role that creatine plays. Firstly, it doesn't replace a poor diet for training. We have to think of the athlete food pyramid. We have to consider the base layer of whole quality foods before heading up the ladder to tier 5 into those supplements. You know, there are many brilliant studies on creatine, but they're done in controlled environments with healthy individuals to gain the maximum results. So if we're an athlete that is looking towards maximizing our results and our performances, we have to be doing the basics right, which is why we know that creatine works best when the basics are already solid. Nutritional habits will always outweigh any supplement, not just talking creatine, but actually we need to have those habits nailed down. Now, this isn't, you know, a weighed out, the calorie tracked diet routine, but ultimately key habits around our nutrition. So then we can look to supplement in that additional creatine to support our growth, development, cognitive function, all of the above that Steve so gracefully spoke about. And then finally, we want to use it. We want to be looking at kind of that layering on top of to support our power and strength athletes, team sport athletes, potentially older athletes doing resistance training. And as Steve mentioned, vegetarians and vegans may suffer because of how much of the food derived creatine comes from those specific products. So that's the role of creatine, or at least the role of creatine, and where we need to go with looking towards bringing it into everyday fashion from there. And moving on into the next slide, we'll see that arguably there are a few, I suppose, and I'll put this in quotation marks, hypes around there. Now, there has been a lot of stick and also praise to athletes going to the extremes with creatine. And we see this in every single sport. The amount of times I've seen research papers of people trying to investigate the role of protein, for example, in muscle recovery and going upwards of 3 to 5 grams per kilogram per day for an athlete, which we know actually is non-beneficial. And the highest studies really show around 2.5 grams per kilogram of protein per day for maximal muscle recovery and benefits around that. And again, athletes will always push the barriers. Rory McIlroy, obviously we all, or most of us, will be aware of his brilliant Masters win in this year, in this summer. And actually what we saw there was him come out and say that he was consuming 20 grams of creatine per day. There's a couple of parts I wanted to touch on in and around here. Now, granted, rapid performance gains have been shown in the research when we high dose or load creatine. Now, my concern is that some athletes, when I speak to them around loading, feel as though a loading phase is really important for everybody. But actually, it depends on when we are requiring that additional kind of benefit from creatine. Ultimately, if we can start with a standardized dose and building a habit instead of yo-yoing our creatine dosage, it's going to be much more beneficial to those nutrition habits that I spoke about previously. So looking at those high doses, splitting that dose potentially into 4 by 5 gram doses, saturates the muscles with creatine and actually can lead to increases in peak power, increases in repeated sprint performance, and increases in strength training and volume. If I'd have added any research papers or references to that on this slide, I don't think I'd have enough space to show how many research papers kind of cite this in their articles, but I'm sure we can send out some reading to those that are interested to know more. And then, of course, moving it on as well and looking around that cognitive function, which I know, again, as Steve mentioned earlier, was actually something considered back in 1992-93. But actually, there's a lot of emerging research supporting high-dose creatine for brain creatine saturation and also looking towards supporting our athletes in a slightly different way and our everyday individuals. So, you know, when we look at loading up on creatine during specific events, such as the Masters for Rory McIlroy, there are potential benefits to short-term memory, decision-making under fatigue, reaction times, and that kind of mental resilience. and specifically around kind of sleep restrictive states, jet lag and travel, heat stress, and of course, looking towards kind of congested schedules. So I think there isn't really a hype there. I think the hype is real and we should be believing that hype. And I think actually, as we get more and more research coming out, and I know Philippe is going to touch on the current research that's out there in our next segment, that actually, you know, we're seeing this kind of super power supplement or product that we can use in every day, but also within our athletic endeavors, whether we're a professional high-end Masters winner like Rory McIlroy, or whether we're somebody who is just, you know, a weekend athlete going out for a bike ride or the odd half marathon across the year. I think there's a real usage there from a sports nutrition perspective to use it across multiple different populations. Now, the one challenge that often happens with high dose creatine, and as I've tried to depict in the next slide, is talking in and around splitting the dosage of creatine, a bit more practical applications of creatine. I think looking at why we might split dose, often the absorption can be better based on the research. Creatine uptake can be a lot better. There's a lot less stomach discomfort or bloating, even if we are using lower dose creatine and not higher dose. It can be more convenient and actually can help to support that routine, you know, a day and a night creatine dosage, or as Steve mentioned, looking to utilize the powder in different products, having it in our morning coffee like I do, having it in yogurt during the day, or potentially even a yogurt, granola and fruit bowl in the evening. Athletes and individuals can start utilizing some really good habits around that. And then, of course, how we split it, we could split it equally. So looking towards kind of 4x5 if we were going for that 20 grams a day, which we can look at, like I say, between meals, shakes, different kind of formats of eating and drinking the creatine. And we can spread it across the morning, pre-training, evening, etc., and having it in different time points in the day to really help with GI discomfort or bloating. And when this might be most useful potentially is when maybe, you know, we're before a tournament or heavy training weeks where we're going to have a slightly elevated creatine consumption, or potentially when we're trying to look towards building that routine and habits. So looking towards targeting those cognitive benefits under fatigue, or even just trying to mitigate the GI discomfort. But really, when we think of creatine and when we talk around creatine, I think the key is ultimately to do it your way, you know, to focus on what's important, to kind of paraphrase what Steve was saying earlier. Whether you're an everyday athlete or a professional athlete, or just an older individual that takes part in physical activity, there's no right or wrong way to go about utilizing creatine. I think it all really boils down to ensuring that we have that regular dose of creatine and support our overall functions and systems from there. So that's everything from me. I just want to say a huge thank you for, of course, jumping on this evening. Philippe's following up from this, and I will be sticking around at the end for any practical-based questions or elite athlete-based creatine questions. But I think it's been brilliant to kind of catch up with you all and see so many of you join live. And I'll hand back over to Rachel now that will take you into the next segment. Thank you, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. That was wonderful. Really insightful information. And we are going to take another short little break so everybody can stretch and go get some water if you feel like you need it. Our next speaker today is someone that you can go and follow right now on Instagram if you want to scan the QR code on the left-hand side of my slide. And when we come back, we will catch up with Felipe Ribeiro, who's joining us from Sao Paulo in Brazil today. And his session is going to be all about the cognitive benefits of creatine. In the meantime, I do have another question for you, so feel free to share your answers in the chat while we take a little pause here. And the question in this break is about science, and we would absolutely love to hear from you. What's the most confusing part of creatine science for you or your audience right now? I'm going to take a little think and drop my answer in the chat, and we will reconvene in about 2 minutes. All right, so our next speaker today, I'm very, very excited to introduce him. And he is someone who brings a very, very important global lens. And he's joining us from Brazil. And I learned this year that Brazil has one of the largest global markets in the world for creatine. And if you start looking into the products that are available there, you might be quite surprised. And they are definitely ahead from a product perspective. If you compare it to Belgium, where I live, Brazil already has many, many more things on the market for consumers to try. So Felipe Ribeiro is a Brazilian exercise physiologist and educator who works really, really closely with practitioners as well as medical professionals and researchers in Sao Paulo. He's really deeply connected to the Portuguese-speaking creatine community, which we've learned is really large, and he plays a key role in helping bridge science and public understanding. Today, he will be sharing his presentation with you, which is called The Cognitive Benefits of Creatine. We kept it simple there. It could have been a really long title, but the long and short of it is that there are cognitive benefits. And for our Portuguese-speaking audience, if you are interested in catching a copy of the upcoming presentation in Portuguese, you can go ahead and contact Felipe on Instagram if you're not connected already. The QR code is right there, and he will be more than happy to share some Portuguese language resources with you, covering the information that he's going to be sharing with us today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Felipe for his presentation, and I really hope that everybody learns lots of interesting things from this session.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the kind presentation. Thank you also, Dave, Steve, and everybody that is here in this afternoon, night, or morning, wherever you are in the world. Guys, I wanted to ask you, before I organize here my slides in the screen, could you type for me in the chat, where are you from? I'm going to use this information during the lecture. Type for me, please, on the chat, where are you from? Dan is from UK, Dan I know. Rachel, Belgium, Chris, USA, Eric, USA, Chris, USA, Natalia, Brazil, Isabella, Brazil, Josie, Chicago, UK, Ben, Andres, Medrano, Costa Rica. Great, guys. Welcome everybody here to this first Jenerise webinar. I'm gonna use this information about your guys' location in a few minutes. And to begin this lecture, let me just share my screen for you, my PowerPoint screen. So let's start this talk when I'm going to explain for you about creatine supplementation and its cognitive effects. To begin this presentation with you, let's talk about the situation that, considering creatine supplementation, we lived mainly considering the period previous COVID-19 pandemic, and also considering like 7 to 8 years ago. We published this paper on 2021, and it is one of the most viewed papers that we have on creatine on the last years. And at this paper, we analyzed the timing of creatine supplementation around exercise. We analyzed if it was a real concern. At this paper, we noted similar concept that Steve mentioned to us in his lecture today, that creatine supplementation can increase total muscle creatine content and physical performance. This is not new. We know this since Roger Harris and Eric Hiltman seminal study in 1992. However, until 2021, we had a doubt that it was the timing of creatine supplementation around exercise. Is it a real concern? We answered this question, showing that the supplementation closest to exercise appears to be superior in increasing muscle TCR content compared to supplementation performed too far before or too far after the exercise. So we conclude that the timing of creatine supplementation does not appear to significantly influence its effects. So the timing, it was not an important factor regarding creatine supplementation. So considering the most part of creatine research, most creatine research was done considering sports performance. And Steve, in his lecture, he has showed us that 95% of creatine is stored in the skeletal muscle. The remaining 5% of creatine is stored in other tissues. One of these tissues that creatine can be stored is the brain. 5% of creatine can be stored in the brain. And why this information is so important? What can we take considering this information? We had published another paper in 2017 that it was an International Society of Sports Nutrition position stand. This position stand was Richard Kreider lead this paper, and Richard Kreider and his colleagues in this paper, they analyzed all the creatine research until 2017. And I noted a phrase at this paper that it took my attention. Look at that. Creatine monohydrate supplementation is not only safe, but also offers several therapeutic benefits in health and sick populations, from children to the elderly. Several therapeutic benefits in health and sick populations, from children to the elderly. Do you remember the data that Steve brought to us in his lecture about the growing research on creatine and its therapeutic benefits? Since 2017, the International Society of Sports Nutrition was emphasizing this for us. And considering creatine and brain health, it came like a mainstream topic more recently. However, from 1999, we had a seminal study regarding total creatine in human brain after oral supplementation of creatine monohydrate. In 1999, these researchers analyzed in young people the influence of 20 grams per day of creatine monohydrate supplementation for 4 weeks on total brain creatine content. So the researchers evaluated this 20 grams per day of creatine monohydrate for 4 weeks on total brain creatine content. They analyzed it via craniomagnetic resonance imaging with proton spectroscopy in gray matter, white matter, cerebellum, and also the thalamus. This is very important considering the importance of each brain region on diverse actions that it can happen in our cognitive function. And this research is in 1999, almost 17 years from now, they found that a significant increase in total creatine was observed in gray matter, 4.7%, white matter, 11.5%, cerebellum, 5.4%, and it was even more pronounced in the thalamus, that it was a 14.6%. And these researchers concluded that the brain is responsive to creatine supplementation. From 16 years from now, we already know that our brain is responsive to creatine monohydrate supplementation. And why this topic is so important? why it is even more important nowadays, this elevation in total creatine content, phosphocreatine, in our brain. This paper is a review article, and it's a very interesting one, that it will explain in a nutshell why this creatine elevation is so important regarding the central nervous system. And this is very important because the main function of creatine is by far to allow the fast regeneration of ATP that is responsible for our energy generation in ATP-demanding sites, like the skeletal muscle, like the central nervous system, and other different tissues, via the creatine kinase activity, that is an enzyme very important in creatine metabolism. Also, we have different studies that shows us a range of possible secondary creatine functions and effects, including, like the researchers mentioned for us in this paper, direct scavenging of radical species. So creatine helps to eliminate these radical species. Also, this creatine in the central nervous system can increase cell hydration and membrane stabilization, and it can possess a suppressor effect on inflammation. Also, this creatine, similar to what happens in the muscle, it can provide us an extra energy buffer property, prevents the generation of reactive species on the mitochondria. So, like the title of this paper mentioned to us, creatine, it can be considered an actor that can play many parts. And as we know that creatine can be named, we can say that an actor that can play many parts, I considering like an Oscar of the supplements. For me, Felipe, consider that creatine, it wins the Oscar of the supplements. And I'm 99% sure that also Steve would give this prize to creatine, so creatine would win the Oscar of the supplements. And I'm 99%, no, for Roger and Eric, I consider like 80%, because they researched a lot about beta-alanine too, and I researched about beta-alanine too some years ago. So I'm 90% sure that Steve's consider that the winner of the supplements Oscar is creatine. 8% sure, let's say by that Roger Harris and Eric Houtman would consider creatine too. So creatine is an actor that can play many parts, also in cognitive function. And when we mean cognitive function, we cannot forget about memory. Everybody nowadays wanna enhance your memory. And this systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials published 2 or 3 years ago analyzed exactly the effects of creatine supplementation on memory in healthy individuals. This paper, that has the participation of brilliant creatine researchers like Dr. Scott Forbes and Dr. Darren Kendall, that is with us here in Jenerise too. At this paper, summarizing this paper for you to make a big paper short for you, they showed us that considering memory, creatine could act as an adjuvant to enhance memory performance, mainly in older adults. So it seems that the teenagers, the adults, this possible enhancement on memory is not so considerable, but in other adults, in aging population, it can be more pronounced. Also, most of the studies, they used a dose of 5 grams per day, till 22 grams per day. And most of the studies, the protocol was done from 5 days, considering a higher dosage of creatine, until 24 weeks. So considering creatine and memory performance, considering this meta-analysis, we have this data. And when aging is coming, one condition that consistently affects our clients, our patients, unfortunately, is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease affects directly the memory performance of our patients and of our clients. And this paper that it was published this year, it was published like 3 or 4 months ago. It is the first study in humans diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The previous data that we had on human on creatine and Alzheimer's disease, it was done on, and it was animal data or cell data. It was the first study in humans diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The researchers recruited volunteers with Alzheimer's disease from 60 to 90 years old, and the volunteers were supplemented with 20 grams per day of creatine monohydrate, split on 2 doses of 10 grams for 8 weeks. 95 volunteers adhered to the treatment. This is very important considering an Alzheimer's disease population. And just a curiosity, at this paper, they recruited also a person to assist the volunteers to remember taking the creatine and to take care of the volunteer during this intervention. And they found after the 8 weeks that the blood creatine increased considerably in 85% of volunteers, and total creatine content increased by an average of 11%. So, considering this slide, we know that the blood creatine content, it is considerably increased in 85% of volunteers, and the total brain creatine content increased by an average of 11%. And last but not less important, they found that there was an improvement in tests for cognitive assessment, especially in memory and attention tests, like they showed us at this table. Cognition improved on global and fluid composites, list sorting, overall reading, and flanker tests. So they showed us in this paper that creatine supplementation, creatine monohydrate supplementation, it is an adjunctive strategy with therapeutic potential and affordable cost for a large part of the population. Like Steve mentioned, like Dan mentioned, let's say the creatinification of society is a viable, it's a possible future to our clients, to our patients, to the whole population. So creatine is viable, safe, and may improve cognitive function in people with Alzheimer's. Therefore, these initial data are promising and reinforce the role of creatine in brain health, reinforcing the importance of the creatine in brain health. Another considerable condition, and a very important one, is depression. And this year, on 2025, this paper was published where the researchers evaluated the efficacy and safety of oral creatine monohydrate supplementation as an adjunct to cognitive behavioral therapy, the CBT, in depression. It was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial that it took 8-week duration. they recruited 100 adults with depression, and the intervention, it was 5 grams of creatine supplementation, plus the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy, versus the placebo group plus CBT. So both groups, the 2 groups of the study, they had the intervention with the CBT, but one group with creatine supplementation and another group without the creatine supplementation, with the placebo supplementation. The assessment tool, it was the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, and after the 8-week duration trial, they found that both groups showed improvement in PHQ-9 scores over 8 weeks. Creatine plus CBT group showed a significantly greater reduction in depressive symptoms. Creatine plus CBT showed a significantly greater reduction in depressive symptoms. And it was safe. The safety profile of this information, they reported us that adverse events and treatment discontinuation rates were similar between groups. So it was not a considerable difference between the creatine group and the placebo group. So they noted, they wrote that creatine is safe for this population, considering a dosage of 5 grams of creatine for 8 weeks, which could be a safe strategy and may increase the effectiveness of CBT in depression. Repeating, I'm not saying that creatine is better than CBT, than the cognitive behavior therapy. Creatine it not took the same place as the therapy. Creatine, it can be like a second strategy, an adjunct strategy on the management of depressive disorder. Okay, creatine does not take the place of a medication or a cognitive behavior therapy. It's very important to emphasize this. Continuing this lecture, we published this paper, like we published more or less 3 or 4 months ago, this paper on Frontiers in Nutrition. And at this paper that we published, that is a research that I'm conducting here in the University of São Paulo, here in Brazil, that we have this paper published. We have also clinical data coming on the next months. And in this paper, in this topic, we analyzed a possible influence of creatine and the muscle-brain axis as a new possible mechanism. We discussed a possible influence of creatine on myokines secretion. Myokines, they are a cytokine that is secreted by the skeletal muscle, which can play an important role in different tissues along the body. So a lot of different myokines can be secreted from the skeletal muscle, like the BDNF, that is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, irisin, IL-10, IL-6, and much more myokines that can be secreted from the muscle. We analyzed if creatine could enhance this production of this myokine, and as a consequence, this elevation on the production of this myosin could enhance the cognitive function, the brain health, considering features like angiogenesis, neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, executive function, memory, and mood. And what would be the impact of these myokines on mental health? I do expect to bring clinical data for you guys in a few months regarding this topic, but nowadays, I let you guys know that regarding creatine and muscle-brain axis, we are investigating via 3 different mechanisms. Via an increased muscle energy, considering the mechanisms that Steve has just explained to us, like the increased PCR, buffering effects, increased ATP resynthesis, and much more. Creatine effects on muscle hypertrophy and inflammation, mainly considering the increased osmosensin genes, reduces myostatin, and much more. And the effect of creatine supplementation on insulin metabolism. So, for those who wanna go much deeper on this topic, I let the QR code of this paper is an open access paper, so you can take a picture of this QR code here in my slide and read the full version of this very interesting paper that we published some months ago. Coming to the end of my lecture, going to wrap up this session, I have good news and bad news for you guys. I asked from you, where were you from a few minutes ago? Because those who answered that is from Europe, if you are also from Europe, if you are from Asia, here in Brazil, it is 6:38 p.m. So I'm not gonna sleep. I will sleep like 10:30 p.m., 11 p.m. More or less, I'm gonna sleep at that time. But guys, if you are in Europe and if you are in Asia, possibly watching this live webinar, you could be a little bit sleep deprived. So it's kind of a bad news for you. You are a little bit sleep deprived. But I'm not gonna let you just with the bad news. What if you take creatine to reduce the effects of sleep deprivation on cognition? What if you took creatine? What if you take creatine to reduce the sleep deprivation effects on cognition? Can it work? This question, it was answered by this paper. This was also a very important paper published last year, if I'm not wrong. The researchers analyzed the influence of creatine of a single high dose creatine on 20 hours of induced sleep deprivation with 0.35 grams per kilo of creatine acutely. It was double-blind crossover placebo-controlled trial with 15 health subjects. The cognitive tests were done at 4 time points throughout the night after 3, 5.5, and 7.5 hours of high-dose creatine supplementation. They made a lot of different cognitive tests, and the individuals suffered a 21 hours sleep deprivation on the night of the intervention. The creatine intervention, it was like 8:30 p.m. At this study, and after 3 hours, after 3:30, after 8:30, 5 hours and a half, after 8:30, 7 hours and a half, after 8:30, the volunteers took the supplement. And after the 21 hours of induced sleep deprivation, it was found that creatine alleviated sleep deprivation-induced fatigue and improved short-term memory tasks, reaction speed in PVT, that is a cognition test, and after oral creatine administration. So creatine could alleviate this sleep-deprived-induced fatigue aspects and improved short-term memory tasks. Also, the processing time appears to be improved, particularly in numeric and language performance 4 hours after creatine administration and could last up to 9 hours. So, the peak performance, let's say by that, the quick performance, it was 4 hours after the oral administration of 0.35 grams per kilo of creatine, and this effect could last up to 9 hours after the initial creatine acute administration. What took the researchers to conclude that creatine induces changes in PCR, ATP, and TCR, prevents a drop in pH level, so it showed us again about this important energy buffer action of creatine supplementation, improved cognitive performance tasks and processing speed, and these outcomes suggest that a high dose of creatine can partially reverse metabolic alterations and fatigue-related cognitive deterioration. So this high dose could partially reverse these metabolic alterations and fatigue-related cognitive deterioration. So guys from Europe and from Asia too, if you are sleep deprived tonight, you could consider taking a high dose of creatine that possibly can help you on your cognitive function tomorrow. And coming to the end of this lecture, this paper also, it was a very interesting paper. It was a paper in the format of a common questions and misconceptions about creatine supplementation. These researchers, these very brilliant researchers, they discussed about the scientific evidence and what the scientific evidence really shows. One of the questions that it was answered in this paper, it was, does the brain require a higher dose of creatine monohydrate than skeletal muscle? And they answered us that it is unclear whether the brain requires higher doses of creatine compared to skeletal muscle. There's evidence that CR dosing, acute intake of 0.35 grams per kilo, that it was the study that I showed you in the previous slide, or doses even bigger than 20 grams per day or 0.3 grams per kilo per day for at least 7 days, or even lower doses from 4 to 5 grams per day for several months can increase creatine levels in the brain. However, the relationship between creatine monohydrate dose and response time, if there's any, still needs to be determined. Possibly, it needs a higher dosage, and it was also discussed in this mini review published some months ago. At this mini review conducted by Professor Darren Kendall, they discussed about creatine supplementation and brain bioenergetics, health, and function. And as a conclusion of the paper, a conclusion about the discussion that it was took at this paper, they concluded that higher doses from 10 to 20 grams per day of creatine for at least 4 weeks appear to be more effective in increasing brain creatine content. This increase is most relevant in clinical practice for patients with depressive disorders, individuals, as Steve and Professor Roger Harris were thinking about in 1992, in 1993, individuals. Nowadays, on 2025, we analyze and we investigate in individuals with bipolar disorder, also young adults under sleep deprivation, and elderly people with mild cognitive impairment, or, as I just showed guys in the previous slides, also Alzheimer's disease. So this is a recent data that we have nowadays regarding if creatine works, and I can say that yes, it works for cognitive function, and it works mainly considering this population. And possibly, I say possibly because we do not have a consensus regarding creatine dosage and protocol on cognitive function yet. There's not a consensus like we have on sports performance, but probably 10 to 20 grams per day. And considering patients or clients with depressive disorders, individuals with bipolar disorder, younger adults under sleep deprivation, as that I showed you, and elderly people with mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer disease. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. I let here my social media, my channels, which you can find me. If you are from Brazil or Portugal, you can send me an Instagram message. I'm gonna make different. If you are an English native speaker, you can also send me a message that if you wanna, I can send you the English version too of the lecture. You guys can reach me out on the Instagram or via email or LinkedIn. And I wanna thank you so much, Stevie, Rachel, Dave, for this kind invitation. And I wanted to say for you that are listening to this webinar tonight, today, in the evening, and I want to say for you, congratulations on investing your time and attention in learning about creatine and cognitive function. And for sure, we will see you in the next chapter of Jenerise here in Brazil and also around the world in 2026. Let's get creatine and see you soon.
Felipe, thank you so much. That was an absolutely in-depth and very, very thorough take on the latest cognitive research for creatine. And I know for sure that I learned an awful lot from listening to that myself as well. It's been a great session. Thank you to everybody who stayed until the very end. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and let you guys know that we will be sending out the full recording before the end of the week for all registered attendees. You're more than welcome to share that link with your teams internally and distribute it with anybody who you think would be interested in watching this back. If you would like to explore anything like this, but actually bespoke to your own team, organization, school, business, please feel free to reach out to us because we do offer that at Jenerise. 2025 has been a major year for creatine, and there is definitely a bright future ahead for this space. It's absolutely indisputable. Whether you got that feeling from Steve's talk or Dan or from Philippe, you can't really argue that creatine is definitely here. Whether it's going to stay, we have to find out, but we're all playing a role in the future of it. As we approach the end of the year, we already wish you all a very Merry Christmas, and we wish you a very grounded, strong, and meaningful end to 2025. Take some creatine, have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you again for spending time with us. Catch you later, everybody. Thank you so much.
Nice job. Enjoyed that very much. Thank you all.
That's so sweet. Thank you so much. I think that was maybe Kyle. Thank you so much. Great to hear that you enjoyed.
Bye-bye. Good night. This is Germany.
Thanks for
Bye-bye,
joining.
guys. See you soon.
Good night, Philippe. Stacey's left.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the session. I think everybody's gone. Bye.
Bye, guys.